A political earthquake has shaken the United Kingdom, and this time there's no way to downplay the damage. Sources confirm that Israel has just expelled the entire British government. Diplomats, advisors, military personnel, and even students were forced to leave the country within hours. Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly sent a direct, unfiltered message, accusing London of betraying its allies and handing victory to terrorists. The shock was instant. A decades-long alliance crumbled like paper in flames, and what was once cooperation turned into open hostility. Inside 10 Downing Street, despair took hold. According to leaks, Prime Minister Keir Starmer's aides were shouting in the corridors, trying to understand how the UK, a nuclear power, G7, and NATO member, could be humiliated so publicly. The message is clear. What happened changes everything, and what you're about to see is a step-by-step reconstruction of this rupture, from the decisions that triggered the chaos to the consequences that could isolate England from the civilized world. It all began just 4 days ago, when Keir Starmer, pressured by his progressive wing and NGOs linked to international groups, made 2 decisions analysts call diplomatic suicide for Britain. First, he declared support for the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, a move security sources say Tel Aviv saw as the final cut of trust. Then, he announced a total arms embargo on Israel, not just offensive weapons, but defensive ones too, including the interception systems that protect schools and civilians from rockets. This double blow hit the Middle East like a bomb. Netanyahu's cabinet was caught off guard, and within hours, the Israeli embassy in London went into emergency mode. What was seen as a diplomatic blunder became, according to leaked documents, an unprecedented crisis. Communication lines were cut, flights cancelled, and British diplomats themselves were ordered to leave while they still could. It was the start of a retaliation that would make the whole world hold its breath. The first victims of the crisis were British representatives themselves. Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward, one of the country's most respected diplomats, learned of Starmer's decision not through an official statement, but via an Israeli protest broadcast on emergency diplomatic channels. UN sources say she was in shock and, that same night, drafted her resignation letter. Chaos spread through the state apparatus. Intelligence was caught off guard. The Foreign Office plunged into panic, and even Foreign Secretary David Lammy admitted he was kept in the dark. Flight records show his official plane, en route to Tel Aviv, was forced to turn back over the Mediterranean after Israeli authorities denied landing permission. The episode was broadcast live on flight tracking apps, and the image of the plane returning became a global symbol of British humiliation. Veteran diplomats call it the night Britain lost respect. Hours later, Netanyahu appeared before cameras in Jerusalem, and his words were a punch to the table of the international stage. A nation that abandons its allies in their hour of need does not deserve their friendship, the Israeli Prime Minister declared in a cold, controlled, and devastating tone. The message was not just symbolic. Israel immediately announced the suspension of all intelligence agreements with the UK. Mossad sources confirmed to the Jerusalem Post that British officials had been reclassified as security risks, and that cooperation channels used to prevent terrorist attacks in Europe were being shut down in real time. Within hours, the shared defense infrastructure, worth billions of pounds, began to be dismantled. Israeli cyber systems protecting British energy grids and banks fell silent. And for the first time in decades, the UK was left blind to threats it once could anticipate. The price of Starmer's moral virtue had only just begun to be paid. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Defense analysts confirmed that at least 17 terrorist attacks on British soil were thwarted thanks to Israeli intelligence in recent years. And now, that network simply no longer exists. The line went dark, a former MI5 officer said grimly. Israeli cybersecurity firms, responsible for safeguarding critical energy and infrastructure systems, began withdrawing support. Inside the government, the mood is one of absolute panic. Without these mechanisms, any failure could open the door to devastating sabotage or cyber attacks. Families who relied on joint counter-terrorism programs feel fear knocking at their door again. And in Parliament, opposition voices began echoing the same question. How far will Starmer's moral arrogance take the country? According to insiders, even the Prime Minister's close allies admitted in private that the decision was strategically suicidal. The UK, once a protector of its allies, now needs protection itself. As diplomatic chaos set in, the economic impact began to bite hard. The pound plummeted against the shekel and major global currencies, and over $30 billion in bilateral trade deals were frozen within hours. British companies dependent on Israeli technology and innovation in defense, medicine, and cybersecurity saw their contracts vanish. Startups were cut off from the Israeli tech consortium, and London's financial sector went into partial collapse, with investors fleeing what they called a moral credibility meltdown. On the streets, tension spread. Frightened British Jewish communities began asking publicly who will protect them now, without Israel's intelligence support. According to The Times, extremist groups are already testing gaps in local security systems. And inside Number 10, messages circulating in private National Security Council groups are desperate. Codenames like diplomatic disaster and strategic betrayal have become the shorthand for internal discussion. Political reactions were as explosive as the markets. Defense Secretary John Healey reportedly slammed his fist on the table during a crisis meeting, calling Starmer's decision strategic suicide disguised as virtue. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper was heard warning cabinet colleagues, "We've made Britain a defenseless target." Inside MI5, confidential reports circulate with alarming titles. Operations at risk, network exposed, internal threats reactivated. Security sources say there are signs that extremist cells in North Africa and the Middle East are already exploiting the gaps left by the rupture. The chaos is no longer just diplomatic. It's physical, imminent, and measurable. And as warnings pile up, a new movement begins. Rishi Sunak, seeing Starmer's popularity plummet, emerges as the restoration candidate. He promises to return dignity and strength to the country, which his supporters say the current government has squandered in the name of selective morality. The atmosphere is one of political war, and every speech now seems like a duel for the soul of Britain. Before we continue, a quick and important warning. If you want to follow every twist of this story and get the next bombshells firsthand, subscribe now and hit like. This shows you're on the side of unfiltered information, the truth that the mainstream media tries to hide, and helps me bring you new data, documents, and behind-the-scenes details in the coming hours. What comes next is even more explosive, and you'll understand why this crisis could forever change Britain's role in the world. And it's at this point that the people begin to wake up. Recent polls show a dramatic shift. The Conservatives are rising again, while Labour's support plummets to levels analysts call prehistoric. National security has become the #1 topic in pubs, on the radio, and in churches. There's a sense of moral betrayal in the air, as if the country had traded decades of solid alliances for an empty ideological gesture. In Jewish communities, fear mixes with outrage. Rabbis report synagogues packed with worshippers seeking answers and protection, while Jewish schools hastily review security protocols. "We've been left alone," say community leaders. Meanwhile, on social media, the hashtag Britain betrays allies, Britain betrays its allies, reaches millions of mentions in less than 24 hours. It's the portrait of a nation that, according to veteran commentators, is experiencing its worst reputation crisis since Suez. The whole world is watching, and what was diplomacy has become a spectacle of national humiliation. If you want to follow every twist and get the next bombshells firsthand, subscribe now and hit like. This shows you're on the side of unfiltered information and helps me bring you new data and behind-the-scenes details in the coming hours. What's coming in the next pages of this story is even more explosive, because the international consequences of this rupture have begun to spread like wildfire. What was once just tension between London and Tel Aviv has become a chain reaction, threatening Britain's very status within NATO, the European Union, and the world's most powerful intelligence alliance, the Five Eyes. And according to U.S. State Department sources, there's a climate of icy fury in Washington. No country, analysts say, wants to depend on an ally that bows to ideological pressures and puts global security at risk. British isolation is no longer a hypothesis. It's an ongoing process, and with each passing day, more doors close. Inside the White House, confidential reports describe the British situation as a credibility collapse. High-level sources say the CIA, Pentagon, and National Security Council are reassessing whether London can still be trusted. The Five Eyes Alliance, uniting the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, depends on total trust, and that's precisely what has broken. Former CIA Director Mike Pompeo declared that Britain has chosen irrelevance over influence. According to him, Starmer's actions sent a devastating message. The UK is no longer the stable pillar of Western democracy, but a country willing to sacrifice its allies for the sake of political theater. Within NATO, the situation is no better. French and Polish officials, in private conversations, are already questioning whether London would have the courage to face a real crisis alongside its partners, or if it would run again, as it did from Israel. It's a brutal question. Is Britain still a power, or has it become just a symbol of what it once was? The financial impact remains devastating. Bank of England sources admit that foreign investors are pulling capital at record speed. Israeli funds have frozen more than $4 billion in investments, diverting the money to the US and Singapore. Biotech, defense, and cybersecurity startups, sectors where Israel leads, are cutting ties with British universities. The technological flow that sustained research at Oxford, Cambridge, and London has simply evaporated. Analysts estimate losses exceeding $100 billion in joint projects. Britain's economic arteries are being drained from within, a Financial Times consultant declared, and the worst is that it's not just about the economy. It's about reputation. Every cancelled contract sends a message. The UK is no longer a reliable partner. In the markets, fear now has a name: the Starmer effect. The Prime Minister who promised moral leadership is leading the country to moral, political, and financial collapse. The new Britain, according to critics, has become an island surrounded by distrust on all sides. As financial collapse unfolds, the human toll is even more distressing. Hundreds of British students were expelled from Israeli universities, and joint research labs in Tel Aviv and Haifa shut their doors overnight. British journalists were hastily withdrawn, and the UK embassy in Israel is, according to reports, paralyzed, with flags lowered and corridors empty. A veteran diplomat described the scene as the most complete breakdown of trust in the modern era. Without Israel's intelligence channels, the UK is now blind to the movements of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas networks in Europe. The cyber oversight that tracked extremist cells has been deactivated, and experts warn the threats haven't disappeared. They've just become invisible. The Ministry of Defense is trying to improvise technological substitutes, but even American companies are cautious. Britain has become a liability, said a NATO analyst. And when allies start to see the UK as a risk, the geopolitical game changes for good. The military consequences are alarming. Lockheed Martin is reportedly reviewing Britain's role in the F-35 fighter program, and Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems has cancelled billion-pound cooperation contracts. Sources say Israeli cyber defense firms have begun removing their protections from British energy and financial networks, leaving the country vulnerable to large-scale attacks. Experts describe this as a strategic amputation, the sudden severing of security layers that took decades to build. The Iron Dome missile defense system, which also protects British bases in Cyprus, has been turned off. Suddenly, British trade routes through the Strait of Hormuz are exposed. The Mossad, which has saved British lives in secret missions across Europe, has ended cooperation. Remove these layers, and the UK is left naked before threats. A military analyst summed it up in one sentence. Starmer treated national security as if it were a campaign slogan. And now the price is measured in lives at risk. And now, the question echoing throughout the UK, from Parliament to the streets of London, remains: is there still a way to repair this tragedy? Government sources say Starmer is trying to reopen dialogue with Tel Aviv, but Netanyahu reportedly responded coldly. Broken trust cannot be mended. Within NATO, there's talk of Britain's dwindling relevance. In Brussels, the EU speaks of veiled diplomatic sanctions, and in Washington, the silence weighs heavier than any statement. In British synagogues, the feeling is one of abandonment. The government has left us alone, says a community leader. The nation that once inspired the world now inspires pity. Britain, once synonymous with honor, is becoming a case study in the collapse of loyalty and sovereignty. Tomorrow's intelligence assessment may reveal the size of the hole. What London can no longer see, what London no longer knows, and perhaps what London may never recover. The final question is for you. Can Starmer still save the UK? Or does the UK need to be saved from him?